In this tutorial, we will be covering the concepts of tank distribution and tank pool allocation. So first, let's start out with tank distribution. In this scenario, we have 3 commodity pools and 6 commodities, where we have 3 pools of red, blue, and green, each with 2 different commodities within those 3 pools. So there's a red 1 and 2, blue 1 and 2, and green 1 and 2. In this network, we have an inflow that feeds to a final destination with a network of tanks in between. In this demonstration, we'll only be focusing on green for the tank distribution. So looking at our green tank, it's configured to have a working size of 10,000 barrels, and it's allocated to the green pool. We also have some initial volume in there as well, with 2,000 barrels of green 1. Now let's say for this tutorial, we want to send a nomination size to the final destination that's larger than the capacity of this individual tank. What we will have to do is configure the system to allow the distribution of a batch to be distributed between this green tank and this floater tank that allows green and red commodity pools. So to do that, we will need to create an object group of a network of tanks that our nominations will be able to send to as an intermediate destination before arriving at the final destination. So let's go to the configuration and go to the object group menu. From here, we can create an object group, name it whatever we like, and select the tanks that we would like to be included in that list of potential tanks that we could distribute the volume of batches between. So we've selected our blue tank, green, red, and our floater tank that allows green and red. So once we've selected all of our tanks, we need to select the batch distribution switch and enable it. This switch, when enabled, will allow a nomination batch to be distributed among multiple tanks. So now, let's go to our nomination plan. From here, you can see that we have our nomination plan folder and a couple of different sources that we have turned off for the time being, where we're only focusing on our green nominations, which are configured as a batch queue sequence type. So looking at our first one, for green 1, we have the source as our inflow of feeder 1, and the intermediate is our tank group that we created in the object group menu, before going to the final destination, which is our outflow. We have our batch size for this nomination at 3,000 barrels for green number 1. Now for green number 2, which will appear as a different color on the canvas, we have the same configuration of feeder 1 to the tank group object group as an intermediate destination before going to the final. However, this batch size is 15,000 barrels, which is notably larger than the 10,000 barrel tank capacity that we have set on all of our tanks. Now let's see this configuration in action in the standalone engine. Upon running the simulation, we can see our first batch of green 1 going to our original green tank. Now that green 2 started in our floater tank for green and red, this will eventually maximize the capacity of this tank, and the remaining volume will then have to be allocated to green tank right now as soon as we hit the capacity on our floater tank, and the rest of that batch of 15,000 barrels will go into green tank. So let's pause here for a second so we can actually look inside the details of this tank, so we can see that the first portion of green 2 W1-2 landed in the floater tank, noted by the 0 in brackets. And now, if we go to our green tank, or the secondary tank, we can see green 2 W1-2, the second proportion, noted by the 1 in brackets compared to the 0, we can see that volume being distributed here. Now that we've explored tank distribution, let's move on to tank pool allocation. For our tank allocation exercise, let's say that we have 2 different commodity pools. So we have our green, which is occupying our green tank and our floater tank, but let's introduce the red tank and the red commodity pool. In this case, what we're going to want to do is utilize the red tank and the floater tank for red commodity pools after we start the simulation, where it starts initially as a green commodity pool. So to do this, let's go to our configuration. And first, let's activate our red tank, which we could have done from the canvas or from here in the vessels menu. And right here we'll find our red tank with a capacity of 10,000 barrels. And now that we have a tank available for our red nominations, let's activate our red nomination sources. So we have our nomination starting from feeder 1 being distributed amongst our tank group before proceeding to the final destination. And we have our red 1 and red 2 commodities here. Now that we've introduced our secondary pool of commodities into the supply chain, let's go to our tank allocations. So from here, you can see that I've already configured a tank allocation group. And when activated, we can drop down and see the two events that I've created. One, starting from converting the floater tank from green to red. So I've selected the date that I want that event to occur, which tank I would like to convert, and to the pool I would like it to convert to. So we're starting the floater tank at green, and I want it to be allocated to the red commodity pool on the 4th day of the simulation. Then, the secondary event, I want the floater to return to green. So, a week later, I select our floater tank, and I allocate it to green for the designated date. So, let's see how this works out in the standalone engine. So you can see that the red commodities have been introduced into the supply chain, and yet we still have these other two tanks disabled. So our only option for destinations are the red tank, the green tank, and this floater tank. On day 4, we will convert this floater tank to be allocated to the red commodity pool. So let's speed up the simulation a little bit. Okay, so this is a good time to pause. Currently, our red tank is pretty close to full, so it's about time that we're going to need a secondary tank. If you look to our floater tank, you can see that a red dot and an S has appeared right above it. This means that this tank is scheduled to be allocated to the red commodity pool. Therefore, it'll have to get rid of the remaining balance of green commodity left in the tank before we're able to ship any red commodities into the floater tank. So let's resume. And you'll see that the floater tank has been emptied, and that balance of material has now been transferred to the green tank, where we now see the received batch of the tank-to-tank pool switch and the volume of material that's been transferred. The red nominations that you see in the received batches column are line fill. So it's residual amount of the previous commodity that was traveling through the shared lines that lead to the current tank that's in use. You may have noticed earlier that this volume of red commodity was visually represented in our green allocated tank. But as you can see here, these volumes are quite small, typically being only 1 to 2 cubic meters. And now that the tank has been allocated to the red commodity pool, the red nominations can now be distributed between the two tanks. So now that you can see that the nominations are being distributed between the two tanks, let's fast forward and see that allocation for the floater tank be switched back to green on the 11th day. Alright, so let's pause here again. Currently, the tank is allocated to the red commodity pool, and that same scheduled icon has appeared above the tank with a now green icon, noting that the commodity will be scheduled to change to a green commodity pool. Therefore, the remaining balance of red commodities in the tank will need to be either emptied to the final destination, or, similarly to what we've seen before, be transferred from the floater tank to the red tank. So in this case, the remaining red commodities were sent to the final destination before the tank was reallocated to the green commodity pool.